Good evening, everyone. This is Jewish Matters Podcast, and tonight we have an amazing Parsha. This week's Torah section, Toldot, explores a lot of fascinating issues between Jews and non-Jews, the future of the Jewish people, the ethical issues of how do you deal with someone who is a bad person, when do the ends justify the means, are you allowed to use subterfuge or lying to achieve your seemingly righteous or justified ends, and the family relationships that unfold in Genesis in the next generation. So the Parsha begins with the birth of Yaakov and Esav. And it tells us already in the womb that the two fidi were struggling together. They were in conflict. Rivka, the mother, goes to find out what's going on to a prophet and finds out that these two people are going to be, these two infants are going to be two future nations that will be in struggle with each other, that will have a seesaw. One will rise and the other will be down than the other one, but ultimately the older one will serve the younger one. And so that's even before they're born. The rabbis tell us that already in the womb, Esav, when she passed a house of idolatry, was struggling to get out. When they passed a house of monotheism, Yaakov was struggling to get out. And this rabbinic teaching raises deep questions about predetermination. Are we predisposed, first of all, to a certain personality type, and we'll see that in a second. But even more troubling, are we predisposed to a certain moral inclination, which this midrash seems to be saying was the case. So it says the two children grew up. Yaakov was an ish tam yoshev olim, was a pure person who sat in tents, which is code for studied Torah or was involved in spiritual matters. And Esav was a man of the field who hunted with his mouth. Now, he was a hunter, okay. Hunting in Judaism isn't considered to be the most spiritual thing one can do. In the 19th century, the Hatam Sofer, when asked is it allowed to hunt for sport, says simply, Jews don't do this. It's not a Jewish thing to just go kill animals. Judaism especially, since you cannot eat the animal. But the rabbis picture Esav as being violent and cruel. And we'll also say, what does it mean he hunted befiv, with his mouth? We'll get to that in a second. But the rabbis have a very negative picture of Esav. Now, where do we see that in the text? So we actually do see it. Because in the next scene, Esav will deprecate the right of firstborn. He will not value the mission of the family and carrying it on as the firstborn. He went out and married local women, which Abraham had prohibited for Isaac, and Isaac was very upset about, so he definitely got the message not to. And when his brother ultimately takes the blessing, he wants to kill him. You can be upset at your brother. You can even feel he deceived or double-crossed you, but you don't go kill him. So we do see that the Torah itself paints the negative pictures of Esav. Now, the next scene takes an aside almost from the main drama of the Parsha of these two brothers. And it goes off into the little bit we have about focusing on Isaac's life. Now, we did have Isaac being brought up as an offering. We did have a shidduch being found for Isaac. Both of those are passive things that were done for or to Isaac. The only thing we really see him doing here is digging wells, which the Torah points out were the same wells that Abraham had dug. And we see him having another encounter with Avimelech, exactly the same as Abraham. Says his wife is his sister. Avimelech finds out, why did you do this to me? And so some point out that Isaac, as we see, is not the doer that Abraham was. He isn't fighting wars, making alliances, growing his flock, although he did prosper. But he is more of an internal personality. He is internal strength and spirituality. And that's not about what have you accomplished in the world. That's about who you become, your relationship to God. And so he impacted the world in a different way. And Judaism certainly values the internal as well as the external. So we are wowed by Abraham, maybe according to a certain outlook, not by Isaac, but that's because so much of what he was about was internal. And although what we do see, and I mentioned this before, is that each of the patriarchs was tested against their nature. Abraham is pure love and givingness. He is tested to have to learn to be tough and almost cruel. He has to kick his son Ishmael out of the home because he's a bad influence, and he has to bring up his son Isaac as an offering. Isaac, whose quality is gvura, internal strength, and accountability, his well is stolen by the neighbors. What does he do? He just moves on. He drops it. He doesn't fight. And the well's taken again, and he moves on again. And eventually he gets to Rechovot, to expansiveness, and we're also told that the wells could symbolize the spirituality he was tapping into. Water represents spirituality. So back to our brothers. Now, it says that Isaac loved Esav, and Rebekah, because he hunted with his mouth, and Rebekah loved loved Yaakov. So Isaac loved Esav, and Rivka loved Yaakov. So how could Yitzhak have loved Esav? We see he's a hunter, he's impulsive. So how do we see his impulsiveness? So this is the most telling about Esav. And Isaac wanted to give him the blessing, but in the scene before that, what we see is that Yaakov sets up Esav, so to speak. Esav is out hunting. He's famished and hungry, and he's coming in from the fields. Yaakov is there with a big pot of stew. And he says, give me something to eat. I'm going to die. Lack of impulse control, living in the moment, being driven by his bodily drives and needs. And Jacob said, what are you going to give me? And so he said, sell me the birthright. And Esav says a strange thing. I'm going to die anyway. What is this birthright for me? Which could mean I'm a hunter and I have a dangerous profession. Or it could simply mean I'm going on a... life has no purpose, ultimately. Everything is just this worldly. And this right of firstborn, which all the commentators say represented the spiritual carrying on of the legacy of Abraham. Remember, later on, the firstborn were supposed to have the roles of the Kohanim, which are the spiritual teachers. So he does not want this responsibility of being the spiritual, moral heir to Abraham. He's chosen a different life path. And so he sells it to Yaakov. Now, how can Yaakov buy it for a pot of lentils? Forget a second the setup. But if Esav really did buy it, so how can you buy it for a pot of lentils? It's certainly worth more than that. The commentators debate this. In Jewish law, if you buy something underpriced, the sale's voided. So Rav Simcha Zissel, one of the great ethical teachers, says that ultimately this was a mitzvah, the role of firstborn. And he says that the value of a mitzvah is really only the value that you give it. And since for Esav it wasn't important, he didn't value it, this is all it was worth. So he could sell it for that price, so to speak. So it says then, he got up, he went, he ate, he drank, he went, and he deprecated the role of firstborn, vayivez. And here we see again the negative caricature of Esav deprecating that which was important, the family values. And then, as I said, he goes off and marries a woman from outside of the clan, which the family did not sanction. So, fast forward, and now let's pause here and ask. So, how could Isaac have loved Esav? So we're told that Esav hunted with his mouth. Now, one of the things he did is he brought his father food. So, especially the Hasidic masters tell us that Esav had greatness in him. And he performed the mitzvah of kivud av. He was the one who was always there, making sure his father was provided for, helping Yitzhak, taking care of him. The rabbis also say, though, hunting with your mouth could mean deceptiveness. He would ask him these questions. Is salt kosher? Showing an insincere piety and trying to deceive his father. So either he tried to bribe his father or tried to deceive his father. That's the way they view it. But back to our question of could Esav have been predisposed towards being bad, being immoral? How do we understand this? So Rabbi Hirsch takes a unique approach. It says the two boys were brought up, and Jacob was the spiritual one, Esav was in the fields. And what Rav Hirsch says is that the parents tried to educate them both in the same way, in the tradition of Abraham, to be spiritual personalities. And that wasn't Esav. And because of that, his strengths were not channeled in the proper way, and that's why he went off, so to speak. And we're told that Esav was born red. Esav means already made. He was born hairy, and his hair was red. So we see another figure in Jewish history who was emotional, impulsive, somewhat violent, and that was King David, who was also a redhead. But King David channeled his emotional ups and downs into the greatest poetry ever written, the Book of Psalms. He channeled his violence into fighting God's wars, although he was a mercenary before that. And he knew what to do with his nature, whereas Esav, it seems, was not channeled that way. That's Rabbi Hirsch. Others will say that he could have achieved greatness, but he simply morally stumbled. And we'll see, will pay for his mistakes. So now, how could Isaac want to give the blessing to Esav? So how could it say he loved him as opposed to Yaakov, who Rivka loved? And one explanation is this, and this is that is said by the Chidushei Rim. This is the so he says that Esav, in a sense, embodied what Yitzhak was. They had a lot in common, their strength, their power. We said Yitzhak's power was internal, Esav's was external. So in a sense you could say that Yitzhak saw in himself a similar quality, but yet Esav was living in the way Yitzhak couldn't. Esav could fight. Esav could build things in the material world. And they knew that they were destined to build a nation of God. God had told that to Abraham. And perhaps Isaac saw in him also the ability to build this nation, which he didn't see in his son Yaakov, who was the more studious, internal type like him. Some people say that Yaakov started out as a Yitzhak in a certain sense, in his spiritual purity. So either Isaac was deceived, or he also had reasons to value the qualities. But Rebekah saw through this. She saw through it, according to some, because she was raised in the house with Lavan, who we'll see was a trickster and was not, didn't have integrity. So she knew a trickster when she saw it. And so she says to Jacob, dress up like your brother and go get the blessing. Now, Yaakov could have said, Mom, how could I do this to my father? It's wrong. But he doesn't. What does he say? But he'll know that I'm not Esav. He gives her a practical question, which she takes care of. She sews him hairy arm covers and makes him the food that Yitzhak had asked Esav to bring to him. So he goes into his father and he says, who are you? First he says, how did you get the food so quickly? He said, God sent it to me. Already kind of a red light. And then he says, come here so I can feel you. And he feels the hairy arms, but he still says, who are you? And Yaakov lies and says, I am your firstborn Esav. Shocking. How could this be? How do we understand it? So, and how do we understand that his mother put him up to this? So let's first deal with the larger question of how is this justified? So first of all, according to many commentators, Yaakov had bought the right to the firstborn, and the blessing was the follow-through to that right which he had bought. Now, it could very well be, according to many believe, that and Rivka had the prophecy that the older would serve the younger. But many say that Rivka never told Yitzhak the prophecy, and that Yitzhak didn't necessarily even know that Yaakov had bought the right of firstborn. Then the question is, why didn't Rivka just go and tell Yitzhak, look, your son isn't all he's cut out to be? That's what Sarah did with Abraham. She said Ishmael is a troublemaker. Is it that she didn't think he would listen? Is it that she was modest and would not stand up to her husband, but had to use indirect means? It's not clear. But she takes matters into her own hands. So how could Yaakov lie? And this is a very difficult moral dilemma of if you say that Esav was manipulating his father and the stakes were so high, are you allowed to use subterfuge against a trickster? And here the rabbis say yes. The rabbis say that if you have someone who is insincere, who is not a good person, and they're about to achieve certain ends, you can take up with them with their own strategy, their own means. So in a sense, to a certain extent, the means do justify the ends under certain conditions to take on a person who is a bad person. And he knows that Esav was manipulating his father. He knows that it'll be a disaster if he tries to take on the family mantle. We already saw that he deprecated the role of firstborn. In terms of the lie, so this is a long issue, not for tonight, but the Torah says, distance yourself from falsehood. The prohibition of lying in the Ten Commandments is talking about a court of law. In real life, there are many subtle gray areas, and he said it, though, in the way of saying, I am, Anochi, who I am, B'chor ha'Esav, but your firstborn is Esav. So he said it in a way that it could be construed not as a lie. Why does that help? Because when you have to lie, you don't want to have to do it so explicitly, even though clearly he was out to deceive Yitzhak. Now let's talk about Yitzhak. If he didn't know who was in front of him, if he had questions or doubts, how could he give the blessing? So some of the commentators, the Sfas Emes says, that Yitzhak never intended to give the real blessing to Esav. The blessing he gave Yaakov was a blessing for material wealth and for strength. The final blessing of the promise of the land, Yitzhak only gave at the very end before Yaakov leaves to go off to find a wife. So, and furthermore, once he is confused, what does Yitzhak say? The hands are the hands of, the voice is the voice of Yaakov, but the hands are the hands of Esav. And this is a key statement, because according to the Chidushei HaRim, Yitzhak realized that something was going on here. And he actually realized that this was Yaakov. Not all commentaries say this. So if, he said, Yaakov has the hands of Esav, if he can learn to manipulate, to kind of wheel and deal in the world like his brother Esav can, but he still has the voice of Jacob, he still has his spiritual side, then I can give him the blessing. Very original understanding. So why was he so afraid? It said he had a great trembling because he realized that Esav might kill him or might kill Yaakov. You never knew what he was capable of. And according to that, maybe Yitzhak did understand what Esav was about. The other way to understand it is just simply that he wasn't sure. He still gave the blessing, and his great fear, his great trembling was this. He realized that just like Yaakov had deceived him, Yitzhak had been deceiving him the whole time. And this is why Rivka set up Yaakov to deceive Yitzhak, to teach him a lesson, for him to see how he's been deceived by his son Yitzhak. That's what Rabbi Shimshon Falhirsch says. And so he learned that lesson. Esav then begs for a blessing. He says, I've already given it. And then he says, don't you have something for me, my father? And he gives him a blessing without saying, may God grant you the blessing of the earth. He just says, may you have the blessing of the earth. So he realized that Esav wasn't living in this godly relationship and didn't have that aspect of godliness in his worldly life. Now, one last thing is that even though we have found basis to justify Yaakov's actions, there are sources, the rabbis say, that Yaakov still paid for his subterfuge, still paid for what he did to Esav. How is that? They say that the tears that Esav shed, said he raised his voice and he cried, he let out a great cry, and then later he raised his voice and he cried, that the tears that Esav shed would in future be tears that the Jewish people would shed at the hands of Esav. Measure for measure. He's being punished. Yaakov's descendants will be punished for the pain that Yaakov caused to Esav and be doled out by Esav's descendants who are considered to be Christianity. So the millennia of persecution under the hand of Christians fulfills the biblical prophecy at the beginning that one will rise and one will fall, but ultimately the older one will serve the younger. The second way we see that Jacob was paid back is his father-in-law Lavan. Jacob works 7 years in next week's Parshat to marry Rachel. And when he has the sisters switched on him, the older sisters switched. Leah is the one who is put in the marital bed. What does Lavan say? In our place, we don't switch the older for the younger. A direct dig at what Yaakov had done and a payback. And we see also in the language, Esav raised up his voice and cried. The only other time that expression is used in the Torah is when Yaakov meets Rachel. He raised up his voice and cried out. Why? We don't know. Could it have been that he understood that there was going to be a lot of heartbreak in his future with her? It could be. So Rebecca tells Yaakov, your brother is just waiting for your father to die and he's going to kill you. So we have to send you off. They say, which was true, that she tells Yitzhak, we have to send Yaakov off to go find a wife. And they send him off. Yitzhak gives him the full blessing of the descendants of Abraham, and he goes off. And it says that Esav saw that marrying these non-Jewish wives caused pain to his parents, so he went and took a wife from the daughters of Ishmael. But Ishmael had been sent out of the family, so even though he tried to fix things and married one of the descendants of Abraham, it still didn't really fix things. Next week, we pick up with the story of Jacob and his wedding and his future challenges with his father-in-law. Have a good evening. Shabbat Shalom. Good evening and welcome to Jewish Matters Podcast. Tonight we're going to go more in depth with the Parsha, Part 2. And the question is, are you allowed to deceive a swindler? Jacob, we saw in the Parsha, takes the blessing from his brother Esav by impersonating him in front of their father. And the question is, are you allowed to use seemingly immoral means to get back what is rightfully yours from someone who's taken it from you or who will take it from you? So imagine you're at work, you work in sales, and there's a big account which you're trying to close. You got the lead, you've been cultivating them, and your coworker inadvertently forwards an email that shows you one of the other salespeople is trying to take this account from under you. He's negotiating with them as well. Can you go into the company's database and change the date when the deal is going to be finalized so that the person who's trying to steal it from you thinks that they have more time to close the deal and you're going to close it before them? So are you allowed to lie? Are you allowed to falsify that information in order to protect what is rightfully yours? On the face of it, the 9th commandment says, of the 10th commandment says, do not tell a lie. So it would seem that the Torah is absolute about this. However, the commentaries, the Oral Torah tells us that the 9th commandment is talking specifically about lying in a court of law, giving false testimony in a court which is usually under oath. And so the Talmud quotes a different verse, Midavar sheker tirchak, distance yourself from falsehood, to apply in general situations. And the Talmud discusses this at length, and there are certain situations where you are allowed to lie. For instance, to make peace between two people, so that they shouldn't be fighting anymore. Famous story of Aaron, Moshe's brother, the high priest, who, when two people fought, would go to one and say, oh, really, he feels bad, but is too embarrassed to apologize. And then he goes to the other one and says, really, they feel bad and are too embarrassed to apologize. And the two come and they make up. That permits, that sanction to be able to lie for the sake of peace has certain conditions to it. Another famous story, there's a wife who always would be contrary to her husband. So as he walked out to work, he would say, honey, could you make rice tonight? She would make lentils. He would ask for lentils, she would make rice. So one day tells the son, please tell mommy that I'd like rice tonight. The son knows what's going on. So he switches it and tells the mother, daddy would like lentils. She makes the rice, which makes him happy, and the son thinks all is good. And the father realizes what the son's done, and he says, you tried to do a mitzvah, but you cannot do it again. In other words, he can't be habituated to lying. So what do we do about Jacob lying, telling his father he is his brother Esav? How do we justify this? Is this allowed? And furthermore, after Esav comes in and the blessing's been taken, Yitzhak says to Esav, your brother, Jacob, came with mirma. Now what does mirma mean? Rashi translates it as wisdom. He came in a smart way because Jacob had bought the right of the firstborn. But the Ibn Ezra, another commentator, says it means deceit. So seemingly, according to some, Isaac the father has accused Jacob of being deceitful. Now, are you allowed to deceive a person who seemingly is a bad person? Esav did not deserve the birthright and the blessing. He sold the birthright, so Jacob is entitled to the blessing. But can he use subterfuge in order to get it? Do the ends justify the means? So the Talmud addresses this in a slightly different context. When Jacob, next week, will meet Rachel, his future wife-to-be, he tells her, he asked the local shepherds, who is she? They say, oh, she's the daughter of Lavan. So when he approaches Rachel, he says to her, I am the brother of your father, Lavan, and I'm the son of Rivka, your aunt. He doesn't say your aunt, but that's who Rivka was. So the Talmud asks, why does he say both things? If she knows he's the son of Rivka, why does he have to say he's the brother of Lavan? Now, he wasn't really the brother of Lavan. He was actually Lavan's second cousin once removed. They were cousins, basically. But in the Torah, we see that close relatives are called brothers. But the question the Talmud addresses, why does he have to say both? And they learn something by saying, I am Lavan's brother. Rachel warns Jacob that her father might pull a switch on him, might deceive him. Why? Because she has an older sister, Leah. So Jacob says, according to the Talmud, I am Lavan's brother, to say I am his brother in deceit. In other words, I can be as deceitful as he is. Don't worry about me. I know how to handle myself with someone like your father, who's a trickster. And the Talmud says, can that be? She says to him, Rachel says, are you allowed to do this? Can the righteous engage in deceit? The Talmud asks. And they quote a verse from the book of Samuel that says, with an honest person act honestly, and with a corrupt person act with deceit. So seemingly this verse permits it. Now this verse talks about that God acts with deceit for people who are bad. But the Talmud takes this verse and applies it to interpersonal relations and justifies or explains why you're allowed to act that way towards a bad person. Now, unfortunately, Jacob does get tricked. Leah is swapped in the night of the wedding. But we see that in the next incident with Lavan, with his father-in-law, Jacob will actually outwit him. He makes a deal after 14 years of hard work that he can finally own some of the flock, and he makes a deal that any spotted sheep he gets to keep. So what does he do? He finds a way to breed the sheep so that the spotted flock increases, which is his, and the non-spotted ones are decreased. Not overtly, that act is not overtly cheating, but it's certainly not in the spirit of the agreement they made. But it's not overtly cheating. But now let's ask, can you overtly lie or cheat to someone who is a bad person, who's going to take something from you in order to protect yourself? And this is the question. So the Talmud has three cases we're going to cite. First one in Psachim, the Mishnah on Passover. And the case was that a non-Jew was going to bring a offering in the temple which was forbidden for him to bring. So what does the rabbi do? He tells him that he should ask for the forbidden part, in other words, like the fat of the tail. Say to the person when you bring it, and I'd like this part of the animal. Now, the non-Jew is impersonating a Jew. He doesn't tell him he's not Jewish. But they're going to be alerted because he's asking to eat something that he's not allowed to, but he's not Jewish, he didn't know it. So you're allowed to use deception to make sure he doesn't carry through his evil plan, his wrong plan. Another case that the Talmud quotes, let's say you have tax collectors. And tax collectors were notorious for being cheats. They would charge people extra taxes and then pocket it themselves. So they were embezzlers. Are you allowed to lie to the tax collector to tell them you have less than you have because you know they're going to overcharge you? And the Talmud seems to say, even to the point of making a vow, you're allowed to deceive the illegal tax collectors. That is the second case. And the third case in the Gemara Baba Metzia, 75, tells us that let's say you have hired a worker and they're working on a project. They're working on treating flax. And if it doesn't get done that day, they're going to be ruined. The question is, and they walk off the job. So the Talmud says, shockingly, you're allowed to lure them back with a promise of an extra bonus. They do the work, and then you don't pay them the bonus. You say, sorry, I was just getting you back so we could work according to our original agreement, which you broke. And the Talmud says that is permitted. And so there are circumstances where one is allowed to use this deception. Now, the Talmud already says that this is only in certain cases. The commentaries say, the Shulchan Aruch says, that in this case, you were going to suffer a big loss if the work was not done right away. Furthermore, you couldn't get other workers right away to do the job. So, in an article on this issue, Norman Fremer in Tradition magazine sets out 5 criteria that have to be met in order for you to be allowed to use these means. The first one is that you have to know that this person has a record of bad conduct. In other words, you're not just suspicious that they might do something wrong to you, but you know that they're a person who does such things, like the case with the email that you got seeing they're trying to take the job away from you, or you see that your business partner has embezzled money off the books and you re-embezzle other sums as well, so he doesn't get his share. Or you know that they have a history of doing this and you suspect that they are going to do it. 2, there has to be adequate motivation or testimony that they're going to follow through on the act, which in the case of the email you certainly had. 3, you're acting only in self-defense after the attack has been initiated. 4, as we said, there's no other alternative to rectify the wrong that's been done. You might have even tried some other options, go to your boss, and the boss says, well, best man win. And 5, that that which is at stake is important, right? You're not going to use subterfuge, use questionable means if the case isn't important just to prove your point. So those are the 5 criteria that have to be met, but if they are, the Talmud does seem to say that you're allowed to use subterfuge. Now, and even in the case of Jacob, impersonating his brother, remember he tried to say to his father, I am, and then your firstborn is Esav. He tried to say the lie in a way which he could reformulate it as not such a bad lie. So, and we saw earlier as well, that even lying for the sake of peace, you're not allowed to do it in order to, if it's going to be a habitual thing. So there are certainly very stringent boundaries to when one can use this. And what I would say is that every case should be evaluated on its own, and one should really ask a rabbi, a specialist in Jewish law, Jewish ethicist, in that case, whether it would be permitted to do the thing that one wants to do. And I'll just end with this, and that is that there are a lot of swindlers out there, and a lot of people, especially in the workplace, people who undermine you, they undermine you to your boss. Someone once came to me who's a lawyer, and he said in the area of law he practices, when you start having a case against, and the opposition's lawyer will start bad-mouthing you in the lawyer community, hoping you'll back off and drop the case. So they start basically smirching your reputation and mudslinging. He said, what should I do? So I was a young rabbi at the time. I sent him to a rabbi who was older and wiser than I was. And the rabbi basically told him, he said, find another area of law to practice where you don't have to defend yourself in this way by using lashon hara back against the person, by defaming the person back to get them to back off. And this is a final discussion that the Talmud says. The Talmud asks, if you see a wicked person, should you try and take them on? Should you try righting the wrong that they've done? Especially if they are successful in what they're doing. And what if even people don't think they're wrong? People think that they look righteous, but really they are dishonest. So there's a debate. One person says, don't start it with such people. They're always going to be able to sink lower than you and use more crooked means and more dishonest means than you will ever want to sink to. So don't even start up with them. And the other rabbi says, no, you should stand up to them. It's wrong. You should stand up for what is right. So which is it? So the Talmud has two answers. It says, one opinion is that really it's talking about you should take on that person when your cause is a righteous cause. It's not just for your own self-benefit, but they're hurting another person, or it's an anti-Semite who is hurting the Jewish people. In that case, you're allowed to take them on. But if it's not, be very careful because, such people are very dangerous. The second opinion is, no. Maybe that both cases are referring to defending your own property. But the first case of saying don't take them on is when your merits are not so great. In other words, if you think that you are not so righteous, then maybe you don't have the merit to win out against them. But if it says you feel like you are righteous and you do have merit, then you can take them on. So either way, though, the Talmud is clearly saying be careful with such people, because dishonest, bad people are often dangerous and often will sink lower than you can in order to take things that are not theirs. And be very wary of using subterfuge against them, because like with Lavan, he wound up out-tricking Jacob, although in the end, the final scene, Jacob manages to out-trick him. Have a good evening, everyone, and I hope this has given some insight.